Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 10th Annual Herbert G. Klein Lecture on Civic and Community Leadership. Please welcome USC's Associate Senior Vice President for Alumni Relations, Patrick Arabak.
Good evening. Thank you. Thank you. It is such a great honor to be here tonight and welcome you to what is the 10th anniversary of the Herbert G. Klein Lecture Series. Tonight, our distinguished speaker, Ben Haddad, a proud Trojan and Herb Klein's longtime friend and colleague, will pay tribute to Klein's legacy and discuss current attitudes towards public institutions in the United States. Before we begin, as we do at every USC event, we would like to introduce some special guests, and I'm honored to start this evening off by introducing a member of our Board of Trustees who's here tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lisa Barquette and her husband, Bill. And I'll tell you more about Lisa later. You're going to be hearing from her in a few moments. We're also very pleased to have a former president of the USC Alumni Association Board of Governors who's joining us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ann Hill and her husband, Dr. John Hill. Got a nice little San Diego pipeline of alumni presidents. This is great. It is such a pleasure to be here back at the Lodge here in Torrey Pines and here in La Jolla and get a chance to spend some time with all of our San Diego area Trojans and friends. We're really proud of USC's long history in San Diego. Not only have we produced a couple fantastic alumni presidents, but we have more than 13,000 USC alumni here in the San Diego area. And I want to thank all of you for keeping the Trojan spirit alive and well here. Please give yourselves a round of applause. We're joined this evening by several of our partnering alumni organizations, including the USC Alumni Club of San Diego County, and their president, Kevin Miracle, is here. We have the USC Trojan League Associates of San Diego County and their president, Shelley Lang. And we also want to give a shout out to, yes, excellent, and we want to give a shout out as well to the Trojan Club of San Diego, the USC Gould Alumni Association of San Diego, and the USC Marshall Alumni Association. So if you're not involved down here, it's not our fault. We have plenty to keep you busy here. Also with us this evening, I promise we're not going to introduce everybody in the room, but I also want to give a special welcome to Eddie Sarton, who is the Senior Associate Dean for Advancement. He's a member of the Dean's Cabinet for the Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences. Oh, Eddie's right there. So thank you for being here, Eddie. And finally, a special welcome and introduction to members of Herb Klein's family who are here with us this evening. I want to especially welcome Herb's daughter, Patty Root. Patty. Patty's son, Herb's grandson, Tom Howell, and his wife, Michelle. And the next proud generation, Herb's great-grandson, Nick. So on behalf of the USC Alumni Association and the USC Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences, thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's truly a pleasure to have you here. It is now my pleasure to tell you more about Lisa Barquette, who is from right here in La Jolla. She's, as I said, a current trustee, a past president of the USC Alumni Association Board of Governors, and she has truly left an indelible mark on what we do as an alumni association. 4 years ago, during her presidency, she really wanted to focus on increasing the association's visibility both on campus and across the world. And her brainchild, the USC Alumni Day of Service, started in her year of presidency and is now going into its 5th year. It's going to take place on March 12th this year. It started off with 25 projects around the world in which Trojans engaged and did community service, and we had about 300 or 400 Trojans come out that special Saturday. We even went to that Habitat for Humanity build up in Burbank. Sorry, we took her up to LA County for a weekend. Coming up next month, we plan to have 120 projects that are going to engage more than 3,500 Trojans around the world. So we are so proud of this. This is a special legacy of Lisa Barquette. And in addition to her wonderful activity with USC, she's also involved in a lot of non-USC activities. She was appointed by our Governor, Jerry Brown, to serve on the board of directors of California's 22nd District Agricultural Association and on the Del Mar Fairgrounds Racetrack Leasing Commission, near and dear to my heart as well. She's also a member of the Board of Trustees of Rady Children's Hospital, San Diego. Lisa and Bill, you met earlier, they have 3 children, all of whom are Trojans. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our friend, Lisa Barquette.
Thank Thank you, Patrick. I'm delighted to be here this evening to celebrate the memory of Herb Klein and to participate in this vital intellectual conversation and exchange. We all have the responsibility to affect change in three important ways: through the creation of knowledge, the transmission of knowledge, and the translation of that knowledge for public benefit. Herb Klein knew this all too well. As a veteran journalist, the White House's first director of communications under the Nixon administration, and the editor-in-chief of the Copley newspapers here in San Diego, he was a highly sought-after counselor to political, corporate, and civic leaders throughout the nation. He was also a trusted advisor at USC, where he maintained close ties throughout his career as a USC trustee, enthusiastic alumnus, and mentor to students, faculty, university administrators, and deans. By providing a platform for a wide spectrum of nationally distinguished leaders to speak on the subject of civic leadership, community activism, and political participation, the Herbert G. Klein Lecture honors his far-reaching legacy and the lasting impact of his contributions. This is also an important opportunity for all of us as alumni, current and prospective students, parents, and friends of the university to gather and be inspired to make a difference, not only in Southern California, but throughout the nation and the world. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker. Ben Haddad is a business and political leader who has long played a vital role in local and state politics. A 1977 graduate of USC Dornsife, Ben honed his leadership skills while serving as the Deputy Chief of Staff and Cabinet Secretary for California Governor Pete Wilson. In this position, he managed the governor's 12 cabinet secretaries and 75 department directors and implemented the governor's policy agenda. Prior to this, Ben had directed California's Washington, D.C. office from 1991 to 1993. He later served as Deputy Secretary and General Counsel for the California Resources Agency. Following Governor Wilson's reelection in 1994, Ben was named Chief of Staff to San Diego Mayor Susan Golding. 2 years later, he was instrumental in the successful staging of the 1996 Republican Convention. In 1998, Ben served as the president and CEO of the San Diego Regional Chamber of Commerce. He was named the organization's chairman in 2009 and chaired the organization's Public Policy Committee twice. And he currently serves on its board of directors. In 2006, Ben joined California Strategies, LLC, a full-service public strategy firm that helps clients navigate the state's political, regulatory, legislative, and media environment. He is also the co-founder of the San Diego Public Leadership Institute, a nonpartisan program for business-minded leaders who are interested in using their skills to address public policy challenges. Whew. Now, on a personal note, you can see why he's so dynamic to lead any organization, number one. But I want to say I knew Ben in his heyday and during USC, and I guess I saw him grow up, as I should put it, right, into these wonderful years that we are in. And I knew his sister Rosemary very well during college also. And I have to say that they get their charm and their wit from their parents, who are wonderful people. And I also have to tell you that I've never met another Lebanese Southern belle like his mother. So with that, Ben, please join us on the stage.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that introduction. I wasn't expecting that about my mom and dad there. I wish they could be here tonight. They're just getting a little bit too old for this. My mom's 89 and my dad is going to be 91 next month. And they're great, and I love them to death, but they're just not mobile enough to make it to San Diego. So unfortunately, we talked about tonight, but they aren't able to be here. But thank you so much for mentioning her, and all those nice things you said about Herb, too. He was an amazing man, which we will get into. So thank you for that introduction, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to take my glasses off because I can't see what I've written if I wear them. So it's either I can see you or I can see this, and I need to see this. So let me start by saying I want to thank the Academy for that's the wrong speech. But I am both honored and humbled to be here tonight on a number of counts, the most important being my undying respect and admiration for our friend Herb Klein. I know many of you were here with Herb when he gave the first lecture 10 years ago. And many of you have attended this series year after year. I'm indebted to Doug Colby of USC Dornsife for asking me to do this. And I want to also thank Pasha Hawthorne of Dornsife for all of her help in organizing this event. Pasha was kind enough to actually send me the video of last year's lecture, given by Democratic political consultant Bob Schrum. And I wanted to thank USC for the equal time. In preparing for this lecture and watching Mr. Schrum's performance and reviewing the list of distinguished individuals who've given prior lectures, the words of the late Admiral Stockdale came to my mind when he was asked for his opening statement during the 1992 vice presidential debate. The first words out of his mouth were, "Who am I and why am I here?" After all, I'm not on anybody's short list for public appearances. I'm not in public office or running for anything. I'm not a celebrity. I'm not an academic. I haven't written any books. I'm not a billionaire. And I'm not even as handsome as Donald Trump. But I am a proud Trojan. As Lisa said, class of 77, a degree in philosophy. Named after two doctors, but I have a law degree. 20 years of public service in Washington, D.C., Sacramento, and San Diego. But most importantly, and why I'm here, is because I knew Herb Klein. Bob Schrum said that he'd met Herb only once, back in 1960 during the Kennedy-Nixon campaign. Well, I can't begin to compete with Mr. Schrum's political resume, but I can claim a distinct advantage over him in Herb Klein encounters. Because I first met Herb when I worked for San Diego Congressman Bill Lowry, but I had far more involvement with him during my time with the San Diego Regional Chamber of Commerce. Now, anybody can read about Herb's many accomplishments online. In fact, you can Wikipedia Herb. But one thing you won't find in the entry is his unsung responsibility as the permanent chair of the Chamber's Nominations Committee. Now, somebody out there has been through this. Chris, every year the chamber says hello and goodbye to a certain number of board members, and Herb was the guy in charge of making sure the nominations of new members were done fairly. He pulled together a very small committee, and if you were lucky enough to be on it, you met in his office at the Union Tribune for about half a day. In the late 90s and early 2000s, the board was huge. So we would go through lots of names. And Herb had a painstaking process. I'm going to put you through it tonight. We're going to put up 85 names here. We're going to talk about each one of them. That's what we would do. I mean, first, the committee would go around the room. We'd throw out the names of potential board members. And then we'd, of course, add those to the names of the existing board members who were eligible to be reelected. Once we had all these names in front of us, we'd go through them one at a time, starting with the ones up for another term. Well, when Herb felt, and it had to be Herb saying enough had been said, he would ask each of us to put our top 10 choices on a piece of paper and hand them in to our faithful clerk, Pat Milliken. And if somebody appeared on all the ballots, or maybe 9 out of 10, they were in. Otherwise, you were thrown back into the hopper, and we go through this whole thing some more. So we would talk more, and then Herb, when he thought enough had been said, we'd vote again. And this time it may be Herb was even getting a little bit impatient, so we might say if you got on 2/3 of the ballots, you were in. But this process would go on until we filled all of the slots, and we had about 5 alternates just in case some of the chosen few declined our offer. But the way Herb ran the process said a great deal about who he was. He refused to sacrifice the quality for the brevity. Sure, we could have arrived at a similar place in about half the time, but the human interaction in that room would have been lost. And he wanted to give everyone a chance to be heard. I can still see him running the show, frankly, listening very carefully, learning always, and then speaking up when it mattered the most. We didn't know it at the time, but all of us were getting a lesson in civil discourse and in civic engagement from Herb Klein. And my wife Ann and I were fortunate to spend some real quality time with him in Santa Barbara, of all places. Now, during my time with Science Applications International Corporation, I was invited to be part of something called the Seminar, which is a group of communications executives from the Fortune 500 companies. To our delightful surprise, Herb was actually an honorary guest of that group that weekend. So we were able to share some cocktails and meals with him. And in a setting that was removed from San Diego, meaning we got some real quality time with him. We got into the stories, and his stories from USC to the White House years, from his precious family time at Lake Arrowhead to his journalism career, Herb waxed eloquently, and we just couldn't get enough. And I will say San Diego was very, very fortunate to have Herb in its corner through so many challenging times, too many to enumerate here. One thing's for certain, he'd be right in the middle of our Chargers Stadium mess if he were here today. For me, Herb's lasting legacy is listening before leaping. His brand of civic engagement was an exercise in civility, grace, and humor. Many in this room spent a considerable amount of time with him. I wanted to call out 3 people, but I don't think they're actually here tonight. So maybe they are. I can't see. My glasses aren't on. But I did want to say, from my vantage point at the chamber at the time, these 3 went above and beyond in his twilight years to allow him to live his life to the fullest, to the last breath. They're not Trojans, but they really cared for Herb as if they were his classmates in 1940. I just wanted to thank Mel Katz, Linda Katz, the Blairs, Phil and Catherine, and Julie Meyer-Wright. They were amazing in Herb's final years. And I would be very remiss if I didn't also recognize another of Herb's close friends for many, many years, my mentor, the founder of my public affairs firm, California Strategies, Mr. Bob White, who's sitting right here. For any of us who've achieved even a modicum of success, there are always key people who helped along the way. And I can honestly say that without Bob White, I may have been here tonight, but I wouldn't be giving this lecture. I kind of stumbled into my chosen profession. I mean, kids today are encouraged, even expected, to engage in their communities. That's not how it was when we were raised. My parents were great, but that's not how we were raised. Being the firstborn of proud, greatest generation parents, though, I was expected to study hard, to excel in sports, as my dad did, go to college, and succeed at something. My grades were pretty good, and I was accepted at Harvard High School, now Harvard Westlake. I played baseball there, and I was recognized as an all-league outfielder, and then I went to USC pre-med in the fall of 1973. But then reality hit home. I quickly realized that I was not going to play the outfield for the USC Trojans, let alone the Los Angeles Dodgers. My summer of selling souvenirs at Dodger Stadium wasn't going to help either. So from then on, my sports career would be relegated to the softball intramural leagues and eventually weekend golf. But reality check number 2 was my future in medicine. My Uncle Ben, my dad's brother, was a neurosurgeon in Detroit. And my Uncle Al was the medical director at St. Francis Hospital in Linwood, California. I survived my freshman year in pre-med, but as a first semester sophomore, as I was telling this young man out here, I can still remember sitting in organic chemistry class, trying to hear the professor explain all these carbon rings over the construction noise of USC's brand new communications school. And I vividly remember saying to myself, Ben, you are never going to be a doctor. And all I can say is thank God for letters, arts, and sciences Dean Norman Fertig. Dean Fertig suggested a plan B for my endangered academic trajectory. One element of his plan was to take a course in the philosophy department from Professor Kevin Robb. Now, you all know what they say about a good teacher. Well, this guy was and still is one of the best. Professor Robb was teaching a course in the history of Western philosophy, basically an introductory course in the philosophy school. I was really there just to fulfill a general education requirement, as were most of my fellow classmates, including a very famous quarterback and our current athletic director, Pat Hayden. He was in that class. And I doubt any of us, and myself included, were thinking about majoring in philosophy. But Kevin Robb, for me, made the ancient Greeks come alive. He made me want to learn more about them and the evolution of Western thinking. I didn't realize it at the time, but he was really building the foundation of my love and understanding of our own nation's governing principles. Now, he doesn't know me from Adam, but I still consider him the finest teacher I ever had. But how I went from pre-med to philosophy without losing my financial support, that was a story, and necessity being the mother of invention. Right? My best friend, Nelson Mamie, another proud Trojan, was 1 year ahead of me. He was pre-law, knew exactly where he was going. He was going to law school. For some reason, he thought I would make a pretty good lawyer. I really had never thought about it, but I discussed it with Dean Fertig. And the dean told me something very interesting. He said, well, you unlike pre-med, Ben, it really doesn't matter what major you are if your law school is the goal. I guess that says something about lawyers. But for my purposes, it sure sounded like a good way to explain a philosophy major to my father. So law school brought me to San Diego, thanks to another Trojan and native San Diegan, Peter Thompson. And Peter's mother, Jean, is here tonight. Peter and I were classmates at SC, and he was another pre-law guy who knew exactly what he was going to do after undergrad. And so he encouraged me to apply to USD, University of San Diego School of Law. But what happened in the summer of '77 between graduating from SC and starting USD Law is what really set me on this path toward public service, politics, and civic engagement. Lucky for me, Uncle Al was not only a great doctor, politics was his hobby. A close friend of his was a congressman from the Linwood Downey area of LA, and Uncle Al arranged an internship for me in Washington. Of course, I didn't want to go. I mean, I was an LA guy. I had this great life going. I had a really pretty girlfriend, no offense, Annie. And I was playing rhythm guitar in a rock band. We were pretty popular on campus. I mean, life was really good. Why the heck would I want to go to Washington? Which I'd heard was very hot in the summer. A lot of humidity, and nothing can prepare you for that, as you all know. Or for everyday life without a car. I mean, my dad was sending me there, and I had to take public transportation everywhere. I didn't know what that was going to be about. But anyway, I went. Congressman Del Clausen was his name. He's passed away, but he was a relatively senior member of the Republican minority at the time, and he had a chair on the powerful Rules Committee. He also had a really nice office in Rayburn with a view of the Capitol. But as with most interns, I would make my way through the corridors of power, seeking out the best receptions, sitting in on some very interesting hearings, and riding the elevators and subway trains with legends. And I'll never forget one elevator ride where I found myself alone with Hubert Humphrey for a few minutes. Or the time I stood next to Jacob Javits at an evening reception put on by the Sturgeon industry from his home state of New York. Now, these men were giants of the Senate. Heck, one of them was vice president. I remember seeing them on television so many times, and television in those days was a much bigger deal. There were only 3 stations. You know, it wasn't that easy to get on. So I knew who these guys were, and I just was mesmerized. I told myself after 2 months in Washington, I really want to come back here again. Forget about the girlfriend and the rock band. The symptoms of Potomac fever were settling in. During my brief internship, I made a lot of friends among the broader intern population, many of whom were housed at George Washington University, and a few of them were actually interns for this relatively new senator from California, S.I. Hayakawa. When I told them that I'd be starting law school in San Diego, they said, oh, hey, we have an office in San Diego. Maybe you could work there, and we'll get you an interview with the chief of staff. Here, me, an intern, get an intern with an interview with the chief of staff? Well, that was big, but they did it. They put me in front of the chief, Gene Pratt, and he quickly offered me a position in the San Diego field office. Of course, I wouldn't be paid. So naturally, I jumped at the chance. Now, the guy running the senator's local office, John Ventura, took me under his wing. I learned a lot, met a lot of folks down here, and when summer was coming around again, he got on the phone to the senator's chief and he said, hey, you ought to bring this kid back to DC as a Senate intern. Oh, I'm graduated from the House side to the Senate. I was very excited. But that summer really sealed the deal for me. I mean, as soon as I was free from law school, I was coming to Washington to work no matter what. Potomac fever had totally taken over. But a funny thing did happen on that road to Washington. When I got to my second year of law school, I came back to go to law school, John Ventura suggested I really not work there anymore, but that I get a taste for local government. His wife happened to be working for first-term city councilman Bill Lowry. And I grudgingly accepted the demotion from the U.S. Senate to the San Diego City Council, figuring, well, it'll be just another 2 or 3 month internship. Little did I know that working at City Hall would be such an incredible networking opportunity. Pete Wilson was the mayor, Bob White was his chief of staff, and the people around them, both from the private and the public sectors, read like a who's who of San Diego. I didn't stay for just 3 months. I stayed for the remaining 2 years that I was in law school. But the game changer was yet to come. Mr. Lowry had his eye on a congressional seat, the one held by veteran lawmaker Bob Wilson. So as I was finishing my third year of law school in 1980, Lowry asked me what I planned to do after graduation. I happily told him, hey, I'm going to Washington. He said, well, why don't you come with me? And I said, because you're not going. Yeah, he had the same reaction. He kind of laughed, and then he gave me the news that Bob Wilson was going to retire after 28 years in the House, and that Bob had quietly enrolled him in candidate training school. Well, the timing was near perfect. I would graduate from USD Law in May. I would study for the California bar, take the test in July, and then I'd work on Bill's campaign from then to the November election. But only 2 things kept this from being absolutely perfect. 1, I needed to pass the bar exam, and 2, Bill needed to win the election. Neither one of those was a certainty, by the way. The bar, as some of you know, was a 3-day excruciating experience. When it was over, I was not optimistic about having correctly answered at least 70% of the multiple choice questions. And to make things worse, I wasn't even going to find out if I had passed before Thanksgiving. And the election was an even longer shot. I mean, Lowry eked out a win in the primary, beating a much wealthier opponent whose father had been a congressman. And that narrow victory gave him the honor of facing a veteran state senator who shared the same name as the outgoing veteran congressman, Bob Wilson. I mean, Bill Lowry was a 25-point underdog right out of the blocks. So nobody expected him to win, just as no one expected Duncan Hunter to defeat Lionel Van Deerlin. But Ronald Reagan was at the top of the ticket, and he had very long coattails. So Bill won. But what about the bar? Uh-oh. It would be 3 long weeks before I would find out. Pass and I go to DC. Fail and I stay in San Diego to take the test in February. Ugh. Needless to say, I could barely speak my own name over the phone when I called the bar for the results after Thanksgiving. But as things turned out, I got to put all of my worldly possessions in an Oldsmobile in December of 1980, and I drove east. My first real full-time job was going to be as a legislative assistant to Congressman Bill Lowry. It's really hard to describe the excitement of working in the Capitol at the beginning of the Reagan administration. Tip O'Neill was the speaker. David Stockman was the budget whiz kid. Cap Weinberger was at Defense. George Shultz would arrive about a year later at State. Malcolm Baldrige was at Commerce. Was there a spirit of bipartisanship and camaraderie? Absolutely not. Was it the same dysfunctional and polarized situation we have today? Absolutely not. But the warning signs were there. Looking back on those days, I can honestly say that the California congressional delegation was a harbinger of what seems to have overcome the entire Congress, both parties and both houses. The California delegation was 43 strong when we arrived in 1981. It is 53 strong today. The Democrats and Republicans met in separate caucuses. Rarely did they meet together. There were a handful in each party that got along, and they met informally as needed, but distrust and dislike of the other side was rampant. So the most obvious failing of that political divide was covered often by the media, and still is today. The California was often outflanked and outvoted by Texas and other large states, and even small states as they get in their coalitions, because those places can distinguish between partisanship and business. When it came to protecting Texan interests, party differences went out the window, and the Texas delegation would band together. Not so with California's delegation. That was the most obvious problem. The less obvious, but far more serious, failing of the California divide was its ugly underbelly. For the left and the right in the California delegation, it wasn't just about policy differences. What was more complicated and truly more poisonous were the personality differences. The left and the right truly detested one another. It was personal. It wasn't just political. Does this sound familiar? If personalizing politics had stayed contained within the California delegation, perhaps we wouldn't be experiencing today's congressional polarization. But unfortunately, in my view, and again, this is just me, the entire Congress crossed the Rubicon in 1987 with the personal character assassination of Judge Robert Bork, President Reagan's nominee for the Supreme Court. The misrepresentations of Bork's position by Senate Democrats were incredible, and most, if not all, were refuted, but not in time to save his nomination or, more importantly, his reputation. His beating was so severe that in March of 2002, the Oxford English Dictionary added an entry for the verb bork as U.S. political slang with this definition: to defame or vilify a person systematically, especially in the mass media, usually with the aim of preventing his or her appointment to public office. Now, I'm not so naive to think that this was the first political bloodletting in history, but there was something different about this one. Watergate was an amazing spectacle, but in the end, the resignation of President Nixon had a bipartisan stamp on it. The Bork matter was highly partisan, and not only was it intensely personal, it effectively lowered the bar for bad behavior on all presidential nominees, and it invited retaliation. So it wasn't long after this sad chapter that the Republicans had their revenge, forcing the resignation of the Speaker of the House, Jim Wright. Without recounting all those sort of details, in my opinion, Jim Wright would not have suffered the indignity of being the first speaker in history to resign due to scandal had the Bork hearings been handled differently. Now, had these two incidents just been the end of it, and the two sides shook hands and agreed, hey, enough's enough, the partisan infighting that we see today may have been marginalized. But instead, the infighting and polarization are the living legacy of this unfortunate period in our political history. And the damage wasn't confined to the halls of Congress or 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. A pervasive erosion of the public trust in its institutions had begun in earnest. Now, this loss of trust manifests itself in many ways, and it's continually fueled in many ways. Now, some of the more obvious manifestations are as old as Professor Robb's ancient Greeks. And let's face it, and there's nothing new about abuse of power, corruption, graft, bribery, adultery. Some are more recent, say in the last few hundred years, such as gerrymandering of political districts, term limits, and the cost of campaigns. But having served at the federal, state, and local government levels during my own career, I wanted to highlight three less obvious topics, one from each level of government. Now, you may not have thought about these three in terms of the public trust, but I believe each are contributing to this erosion. Picking up in the aftermath of the Wright resignation in the late 80s, none of us had the foresight to predict what was to come. After all, there were still Democrats and Republicans on the Hill talking to each other, getting things done. My boss actually was not an uncommon politician at the time, but you may be hard-pressed to find anyone like him today. because he was a fiscal and social conservative who actually talked with fiscal and social liberals on a regular basis. Gee, amazing. From his perch on the House Appropriations Committee, he worked well with everyone. His stock in trade, the congressional earmark. You want to restore some civility, discipline, and civic engagement in the federal government? Restore the earmark. Earmarks done right accomplish a great deal. For one thing, Congress is a co-equal branch of government and should not cede all budgetary discretion to the executive branch. Second, the appropriations process, including the earmark, provides the lubrication for the intricate machinery of human interactions that comprise the legislative process. The abuses of the earmark can be remedied without throwing out the entire practice. In fact, if Congress simply enforced its own rules, most, if not all, of the abuses that occurred would have been avoided. Instead, the media and the public reacted to the bridge to nowhere, and in typical form, the Congress overreacted to the reaction. Now, Groucho Marx predated the earmark hoopla by a long shot, but he had a great way with words and a keen insight into the political process. He once said, "Politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it incorrectly, and applying the wrong remedies." That is the earmark story in spades. Bridges to nowhere were ever present in spending bills, but the trouble wasn't the bridge or that someone could advocate for it. It was the way in which the bridge would find its way onto a bill. The remedy shouldn't have been to kill the lawmaker's ability to introduce the bridge. It should have been disallowing those introductions outside the proscribed hearing and markup process. At the height of the earmark debacle, members of Congress were introducing their pet pork items into the bills that already had gone through their respective houses and were now the subject of what's called a House-Senate conference. That's against the rules, plain and simple. If an item was not contained in a bill coming from the House, and it wasn't contained in the bill coming from the Senate, it wasn't supposed to be allowed to find its way into the conference report, let alone the final bill coming back out to be signed by the president. Now, earmarks or the prohibition may seem like a small potato when compared to the Bork hearings, Speaker Wright's downfall, the House banking scandal, Iran-Contra, lots of other spectacles that followed. But in fact, the portrayal of them as secretive and self-serving and unethical further fueled the loss of the public's trust in its governmental institutions. What's worse, the loss of earmarks deprived the House leadership from imposing any semblance of discipline on its own members. This has markedly contributed to the polarization we see on Capitol Hill today. Both President Obama and South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley spoke of this public trust issue, not earmarks, but they spoke about public trust in January. The President in his State of the Union address, the Governor in her Republican response. The President said, "This topic may be the most important thing I want to say tonight." He said democracy does require basic bonds of trust between its citizens. Most of all, democracy breaks down when the average person feels their voice doesn't matter, and that the system is rigged in favor of the rich or the powerful or some narrow interest. Governor Haley echoed those remarks, chiding both political parties for bearing the responsibility for the erosion of public trust in America's leadership. She said the foundation that has made America that last best hope on earth hasn't gone anywhere. It still exists. It's up to us to return to it. Well, the political class is not alone in damaging the public trust. I mean, the courts and law enforcement have done and are doing their share. Journalism, social media, special interests of all shapes and sizes have to bear some responsibility. Oddly enough, even well-meaning reactions to perceived abuses have resulted in diminishing the public trust. And for me, direct democracy, or the initiative process, is Exhibit A. It's intended to address the stranglehold of special interests on the legislature. The initiative process has evolved into another attack on the public's trust in its institutions. The Founding Fathers were wise to establish a representative form of democracy. There is no initiative process. There are methods to amend the Constitution or change federal law, but not by getting enough signatures on a petition. Governor Hiram Johnson certainly had his reasons for bringing the initiative, referendum, and the recall to Californians in 1911. Reformers and progressives in his day were trying to break the lock that special interests, such as the powerful railroads, had on the legislature. He was trying to find a way to allow citizens to retake their government. Unfortunately, the special interests have found a way around his reforms. California is a direct democracy experiment that has run off the tracks. The lion's share of our state budget is on autopilot due to special interest-sponsored initiatives that took power away from our elected representatives. Even the legislature and the governor, frankly, use the initiative process rather than their tools they've been given to effect change. So not surprisingly, very clever people figured out how to manipulate the public and the process. They cloak themselves in democracy and the public interest, but in fact, they are pushing a narcotic that renders our elected officials practically meaningless. In a seminal white paper for the Public Policy Institute of California back in 2000, Fred Silva, some of you know Fred, he's a highly respected veteran of California state politics. He said that today's initiative process could be described as the initiative industrial complex, given the number of companies providing services such as signature gathering, legal services, and campaign consulting that are now integral and apparently essential to the process. Fred said, the days of romanticizing it as the citizens' initiative process are long over. Now, some will take solace or say, well, you know, the fact very few initiatives compared to the number that are actually in circulation make it all the way to the ballot. That doesn't excuse the bad law that is continually added to both the California Constitution and the state statutes. While it is true that from 1911 to 2000, only 1/4 of the over 1,000 initiatives in circulation actually qualified for the ballot, and of those, only 1/3 were approved by the voters. That third constituted 94 changes to our statutes and Constitution. 94. Regardless of your political persuasion, can you imagine the U.S. Constitution being subjected to that kind of treatment? Without question, we're going to face more of these initiatives this year, none of which, in my view, will make California a better place to live or which will restore the public's faith in its institutions. Nor has the local level of government been spared its own misdiagnosis of political problems. On top of the runaway initiative and referendum process, we have another layer of direct democracy overdose with which to contend, so-called community planning groups. They're enshrined in city council policy, originally intended to give more neighborhood input to city planners in its general land use plans were introduced or updated. In San Diego, this idea originated in the 60s, and on its face may seem innocuous, but creating glorified homeowners associations throughout the city is not the way to better planning. In fact, it's become a recipe for the not in my backyard syndrome or NIMBYism. The council policy on these groups clearly says that they're to be advisory in nature, but there are times when one has to wonder which one is more powerful, the advisory group or the legislative body that created them. Frankly, I don't blame the community planning groups for assuming that they have more power than they actually do. Because if you look at the council policy establishing them and how a community member would qualify to serve and how long they can serve and all these other rules, it resembles a mini legislature for each community. Now, I'm sure some find it noble to involve as many people as possible in the planning process, but an alternative view is that the creation of these planning groups is an improper delegation of authority. The voters elect a mayor and a council to conduct the city's business, much of which involves land use planning. The voters did not elect the mayor and the council to pass their power to groups of their neighbors. The better, more responsible approach to delegate land use planning authority is to create a planning commission. Hey, the city did that with a charter change back effective in 1970. This provides an excellent forum for community members to voice their concerns over a potential development. There's no need to create many commissions in every corner of the city. Well, the more California and its local governments experiment with direct democracy, whether through initiatives, referendums, or community planning groups, the further we move from the genius of our founding fathers, the further we move from our roots as a republic. I'm going to turn back the clock here a little bit, but when asked upon his exit from the Constitutional Convention in 1787, whether we now have a republic or a monarchy, Benjamin Franklin responded, "A republic if you can keep it." It is such a simple utterance, yet it is such a profound statement. At the time, Franklin's quip may have been interpreted to mean, well, if we can keep the executive branch of our new government from exerting authority over the other two, or he may have feared that our new nation hadn't seen the last of King George. He had been right about that. But another way of looking at it was the way James Madison looked at it when he developed the term republic in his Federalist Papers, where he said that a republic is a state that does not practice direct democracy, but rather has a government indirectly controlled by the people. Our founders could have chosen to institute a direct democracy, but instead opted for a representative form of democracy. Lately, I've been wondering why I'm so frustrated with nearly everything associated with public policy, probably because I'm living in the capital of direct democracy. But that aside, from the moment that I set foot in the Capitol to begin my first full-time job in 1981, I've always looked forward to going to work. No 2 days are the same. The challenges are endless. But I feel this disillusionment creeping in. I've kind of grown weary of all the predictable political barbs hurled by politicians of all stripes, and frankly, the hypocrisy practiced by both parties. It's getting harder and harder to suit up every day and charge onto that playing field. On the toughest days, my thoughts turn to my mentors, my dad, my Uncle Al, Bob White and Pete Wilson, and of course, Herb Klein. I wonder often what Herb would think of so many things that are swirling around us. The 2016 elections, the Trump celebrity phenomenon, the Sanders socialist platform, the growing ideological divide between the parties and within the parties, or the decline of journalism as he knew it, and the rise of social media. We'll never know what Herb would say about these things, but we do know that Herb would never, ever give up trying to make our country, our state, our region, and our city better through civic engagement. With the left moving further left and the right moving further right, it would be easy to throw in the towel, to walk away in disillusionment, to think that this great American experiment has run its course. But that is not what Herb would think. Herb believed in talking to people, especially those people who he might hold a different point of view from. He was not one to cower or hide in the sanctuary of his own office, or one to give a fiery speech to rile a mob, or to play clever political games to embarrass a foe. Herb was honest and thoughtful, but not naive. He spoke in simple terms, but he thought strategically and incisively. So when I was thinking of how Herb would react to today's headlines, for some reason I was drawn to The Lord of the Rings. Probably because my wife makes me watch the extended versions every Christmas. Now, if you haven't seen it or read the Tolkien trilogy, this isn't going to mean much to you. I apologize. But if you have, indulge me for a moment and recall the words of the Hobbit, Samwise Gamgee, as he's taking stock of all he and his best friend, Frodo Baggins, have been through and what lies ahead of them if they're going to really save Middle-earth. Samwise says this. He says, "It's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and danger they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know the end, because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad had happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness must pass. A new day will come, and when the sun shines, it'll shine out the clearer. Those were the stories that stayed with you, that meant something even if you were too small to understand why. That there's some good left in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for." Herb would be the first to remind us there is much good left in this world, in this republic, and it is worth keeping, it is worth fighting for. We'll see you all on the playing field. Fight on. Thank
At this time, if anyone has questions for Ben.
Now that I've offended all the community planners in the room, I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you for your comments. There's a talk about civic disobedience coming up in the near future. Your comments on how that might work and how that might play out.
I have no idea. Well, that's an important topic, and I'm sure in the context of all that's been going on around the country, particularly as we've seen it play out in some of the cities that have had issues with law enforcement. Is that the kind of civic disobedience you're talking about? The organized protests and that sort of thing?
I was actually thinking about maybe if you're not feeling represented with taxation, civic disobedience with taxation.
Yeah, no, I don't have any comments about that. Because I pay my taxes. I'm well represented. No, I'm kidding. I really hadn't thought about that. Any other? I think I've stifled the. Thank you all very, very much. Oh, sorry, Chris. Almost.
First of all, beautiful job, Ben.
Thank you, Chris.
Herb would be very proud.
Thank you. Thank you for
Fabulous. Yeah, thank you.
that. Thank you, Herb.
Wonderful. So is it possible that the left will move to the left, the right moves to the right, and somewhere in the middle, the hope is found?
Hope is found.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there now about how far left and how far right things are moving, at least if you look at the voting patterns in the Congress. And there's comparisons to like when I was there in the 80s and Bob was there, and the middle was much larger. There were more people in it that voted, they may have been Dems or Republicans, but they voted, they weren't way over on the flanks. And now they're showing these huge majorities on both parties voting out on the fringes. And how we get it back, I'm not exactly sure how. I would rather have talked about how we get it back. I'm not sure how we get it back because it is so pervasive and it's so personal too. I hope we can dial all that down and get back to talking about the issues and getting away from all the attacks. But you see what plays. I mean, you're watching the presidential sweepstakes, and you know where the ratings go. It's to who says the most egregious thing. And the press is covering it. And I hope we can break the stranglehold because this is it's not good.
First of all, I thought it was a fantastic talk.
Thank you.
Almost rejuvenating. But what do you think about the role that money plays in politics now? Because the idea of democracy is one vote, one person, one vote, and now I think that this has all been taken away.
Well, there's no question that, as they say, whoever said it way back when, money is the mother's milk of politics, and it's been that way for a very long time. I don't see it changing. And anytime they've tried to reform this thing every 20 years or so. Campaign finance reform, there was campaign finance reform in the 70s, back in the 90s, and then we have the Citizens United case decided by the Supreme Court. And it's, I don't know how you regulate it, Frank, because the problem with trying to tell people that they can't spend their money, for one thing, it's unconstitutional to tell them they can't spend their own money. So you don't want to turn everything over just to people who can spend their own money and are wealthy enough to be elected. So you can't, you don't want to put up those kinds of reforms. I don't know how you really can't get money out of the, I don't think any system you set up to try to control campaign finance, the folks will find a way around. There isn't it's just like the initiative process. I mean, you set one up, they'll figure out a way around it, and they'll get done what they need to get done. And the money is coming in from everywhere, though. Don't think for 1 minute it's only on one side. But I wish it weren't as influential. But I agree with you. It's always bothered me that it's so pervasive throughout the system. You know, I work for a member of the House. They're running every 2 years. They are running all the time. They never stop. They are raising money as we speak here. Scott Peters and the lady running against him and all the others. My boss was every 2 years, right, Bob? I mean, they're on this hamster wheel. The Senate has a little bit of a break at least. I mean, they have 6-year terms. They don't have to, when they get in, they don't have to run right away, but they have to start running, especially in a state like California, where you're trying to reach, at the time it wasn't 39 million, but it was 30 million. It was a heck of a lot of people. So the demands are huge to go out and raise, the need is huge to go raise that money, because how else are you going to reach all those voters? You're not going to walk all those precincts. You're not going to do it the way they do it in New Hampshire with town hall meetings. It's too big. So I wish I had an easy answer, but I promise you, no matter what system you set up, they will get around it, and the money will still get in.
Ben, John Shannon.
Hey, John.
Thank you so much for bringing up difficult subjects. It's only by attacking or speaking about things that are difficult do we ever make any progress. And so I come from an interesting background. I have a background in technology. I work in real estate. And maybe because I think logically, I've got myself embroiled. I got myself onto community planning groups. I was a chair of one.
Congratulations.
Yeah. So you didn't offend me, because I think there are a lot of things that need to be done, need to be said, but sometimes the planning groups maybe do get in the way. And one of the things in real estate that in San Diego, a lot of people want to live here, a lot of people's children would like to live here, but that's becoming less of a reality. And the reason why is because there isn't enough housing being built. In fact, less than half of the housing, 17,000 new units a year, we're building less than half of that. And it's making it very difficult. We're seeing property values go up and taking people to the sidelines or sending them to other states. I'll get to my point here. But what that's doing is we have just a cost of a new building, $600,000 house, the average cost of a house in San Diego County. 42% of the cost of a new house is in fees. Fees. Now, other areas, we're talking 15, 25%. I sit on the San Diego Association of Realtors Government Affairs Committee, and we have people pulling out their hair on that committee because we cannot change things to incentivize the 150 builders that are sitting on the sidelines, not being able to predict, to be able to build the housing stock that they need to allow people's children here to be able to live. And this is a big thing because it will stall our economy here in San Diego. And I'm looking at this happening. Coming from technology and looking at it from real estate perspective, here we're right around all these biotech companies make 12 offers, 3 people come to San Diego because they look at the housing costs and they say, we can't do this. What do you have to say about this? Thank you.
Well, as I pointed out in the first part of my talk, I'm not running for anything. So as a result, I don't have talking points on all these wonderful subjects that the politicians have to speak on every time they appear before audience. But I will say that first you need to move because you're not going to be able to live here. But no, secondly, that a politician would never tell you. But no, the study that just came out of Point Loma Nazarene on the housing affordability has all these numbers in it. Some of you were citing a number of them. It's a serious problem here. All of the elected officials are struggling with it. Barrett Tetlow is chief of staff to Scott Sherman. He's sitting right here in the audience. His boss struggles with it. Everybody's trying to figure out how we make this place affordable, but at the same time not lose our quality of life. It's a real difficult thing to do. And some of it's out of our control. Some of it's imposed on us from Washington and Sacramento in terms of costs. Some of it's locally imposed, no question about it. So the planning group thing, it feeds into it a little bit. You're delaying the time it takes to want to build anything in this place. It's forever. So the costs get put into all of that. And the planning groups, while they mean well, it's just one more layer of stuff you have to go through when you want to get anything developed. And again, it just drives up the costs. We want all this, public discourse, and we want civic engagement, and we want quality of life. Well, these things come at a cost. And in San Diego and San Francisco and coastal LA and parts of this state, it is very expensive to live, and a lot of this is self-imposed. I don't know there are a bunch of solutions contained in those studies, things that the elected officials need to do to make it different. I don't think the votes are there to change it. I think the votes are all over the place. Everybody has their own view of what affordable housing means and what's more important than what else. CEQA and all this stuff. I'm not suggesting we throw out environmental laws or environmental quality is very important. But these things have been used as tools to stifle folks, to delay things beyond reasonable time frames. They also do good things. The laws are not bad. They're there for a reason. But they've been abused, just like the initiative process has been abused. Folks use these things for their own ends and not really for the original intention for which they were passed. But the way out of it, that's the $64,000 question in San Diego is cost of housing. I don't know how we get it down. People just can't, our kids can't afford to live here. Yes.
Well, this is,
Lisa.
just on my own personal experience with community planning groups, I was shocked to see how they use social media, too.
They use it well.
Very well, but it's so far slanted, and it's it's a runaway train, actually. And if you're on the other side, it's very hard to keep up with that and defend yourself. So that's one issue. But if you take our social media, do you think the Bork nominations would have had a different outcome?
Wow, never thought about it in that context. It would have probably been worse. The thing with Bork, I wasn't arguing that Bork should or shouldn't have been confirmed. It was how the process went down. There were definitely differences of opinion. People should express those differences of opinion with somebody who's going to sit on the court for life. That's a serious appointment. But the vilification and the personal attacks and all that, that's uncalled for. And I think social media, frankly, would have made it worse. Because that's what you see out there. A lot of it's anonymous out there. You don't have to tell them your name. You just start spewing stuff out on social media and letting people have it. So I don't think it would have helped anything. Thank you so much.
So first of all, I want to thank everybody for being here. Thank you once again to Ben, but thank you for those provocative questions. I think that we're not going to have any problem identifying some topics for discussion at the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th Annual Herb Klein Lecture Series, so thank you. But hey, listen, on behalf of the Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences and the USC Alumni Association, Ben, thank you again. We're going to present you with a special little gift. And after hearing what this gentleman has gone through in his wonderful storied career, I think this will come in good handy. So thank you again.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
And for everybody else, thank you once again for joining us this evening. We look forward to, we'll be back again next year, and it's really an honor to be here. This was probably our best attended Herb Klein lecture since the program was founded 10 years ago. We do have a reception for you afterwards, some coffee to perk you up for your drive home, if the conversation didn't do that already. And once again, we appreciate everybody being here tonight, and come see us on campus when you're back up in LA. Have a good night. Fight on.